Futurized goes beneath the trends, tracking the underlying forces of disruption in tech, policy, business models, social dynamics, and the environment. Join me, futurist Trond Arne Undheim, PhD author, investor, and serial entrepreneur, as I discuss the societal impact of deep tech such as AI, blockchain, IoT, nanotech, quantum, robotics, and synthetic biology, and tackle topics such as entrepreneurship, trends, or the future of work. I'm a research scholar in global systemic risk, innovation, and policy at Stanford University. On Futurized, I interview smart people with a soul, founders, authors, executives, and other thought leaders, or even the occasional celebrity. Futurized is a bi-weekly show preparing you to think about how to deal with the next decade's disruption so you can succeed and thrive no matter what happens. Futurized, conversations that matter. If you're new to the show, seek particular topics, or are looking for a great way to tell your friends about the show, we've got the episode categories. Those are at futurized.org/episodes. I am the co-author of Augmented Lean, a human-centric framework for managing frontline operation, and the author of Health Tech, Rebooting Society's Software, Hardware, and Mindset, Future Tech, How to Capture Value from Disruptive Industry Trends, Pandemic Aftermath, How Coronavirus Changes Global Society, Disruption Games, How to Thrive on Serial Failure, and of Leadership from Below, How the Internet Generation Redefines the Workplace. For an overview, you can go to trondundheim.com/books. At this stage, Futurized is lucky enough to have several sponsors, and to check them out, go to futurized.org/sponsors. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or to get an overview of other services provided by me, including how to book me for keynote speeches, please go to futurized.org/store. We'll consider all brands that have demonstrably positive contributions to the future. Before you do anything else, make sure you are subscribed to our newsletter on futurized.org, where you can find hundreds of episodes of conversations that matter to the future. Please also leave a positive review on iTunes. Thanks so much. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. Let's talk about drones. So Matt, you're an engineer, you're an entrepreneur, you have a drone company, and you're very excited about this enormously vast space of ocean that we are trying to learn more about, and with these enormous opportunities and challenges that the drones have for marine surveillance. So that's, I guess, what we want to talk about. But first, let me understand a little bit. So you are an engineer. You then went to work for large aerospace companies. Tell me a little bit about your background before you went entrepreneurial and went straight into this drone use case.
Sure. I think it's just, I don't come from an entrepreneurial family. Both my parents are graphic designer. My sister is a graphic designer as well. I didn't really know what like entrepreneurship was. So I guess most people in that case, if you're into engineering, you just study that and you go work for a big company in the field, which for me, being passionate about aerospace in Europe, like Airbus is probably the best thing you can get. So I went there. I spent a few years just trying to get into the most exciting department in Airbus, which is that secretive, like future projects office. It's a bit like, I don't know if you've heard of Skunkworks, but that's kind of like the equivalent. And then got there and then was super disappointed because I expected it to be, like the equivalent of SpaceX, but for airplanes. But it's still very much like pretty boring, just because, the rate of innovation in large airplanes is non-existent. I think it's like 0.3% per year, the improvement in fuel efficiency. So yeah, that's kind of like how I got studied in aerospace and realized, large companies in the field, it's not going to be super interesting. And there are, I think, better things to do at the minute in this aerospace industry.
That's it. Well, that's an interesting observation. Let's since they're not here to defend themselves, let's not talk too much about specific companies. But it's makes me sad to hear that large companies can't innovate in a space which needs tremendous amounts of innovation. And lately, another large aerospace company have been having quality problems. So this doesn't exactly bode well, or I guess it does bode well for some of the startups and smaller upstarts in that industry, because the challenges are certainly there, and there are great things expected from air transportation in the next few decades. So,
it's to be fair, I'm not critical at all in some way, because I think it's just I was personally not the right fit for that type of company. And it's just when you're when you're in a mature industry that just need you to keep churning the same product with like minimal improvement, because you're not focusing on I don't know, like making the plane electric because it's too difficult or whatever. You're just trying to keep matching the demand and keeping it safe. Then why would you take a wild bet and make much better aircraft? That's just not what you
Yeah,
should
I'm
be
just
doing.
questioning that assumption, is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I don't think that assumption holds anymore. That the mission of the aerospace industry is just to keep the wheels turning and keep people generally safe. I don't think people's expectation is that that's what's happening. That's actually a
that
pretty surprising observation.
yeah. No, but it's very so. There are some very interesting point actually. There is that one, actually aircraft manufacturers don't sell to airlines. They sell mostly to leasing companies that then loan the plane to the airlines. And I think it's been continuously growing. It used to be quite small, and now it's like the majority is going to leasing companies. And so in that case, you're selling very expensive products that are meant to last for 40 years. Typically, that's what happens if you buy a large airliner. And you sell this to those few leasing companies. These leasing companies don't want you to come up with a breakthrough product that is going to be much better than the plane they bought from you 20 years ago, because that destroys their asset base. So your main customers actually don't want you to innovate, and the other. So that's one aspect, which is, it's kind of a problem. And the second one is that right now there's more demand than supply. So like if you were to buy an A320 or a 737, which are like the smaller airplanes in the big manufacturer range, these are the cash cows for these companies. They're the one that make the money. These one, if you want to buy one today, you might book it for like 5 or 10 years from now. I can't remember the exact number, but it's like ridiculously far. So if you have those two forces and you're a big aircraft manufacturer, even if you wanted to make the change, it's actually really difficult to do, because how do you do it if your customers don't really want it, and like there's so much demand that you just have to supply quickly, and yeah, it is difficult. Like
I feel like you're inviting me into the airline industry right now. This sounds like a massive, massive change opportunity to me.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to our topic. I'm curious. So basically, you were in big airlines for a little while, and then you felt like you wanted to do something faster, more innovative. How did you settle on the drone use case? Is that sort of the only obvious sort of very similar thing that's sort of outside of that industry, or were you considering other things?
No, I think I just went straight to drones, just because. So I started the company in 2016, and back then it was quite different to where the aerospace industry is today in terms of startups. Because right now you have, I don't know how much you've heard of electric air taxis, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but like these back in 2016, you already had some. Like you had to be at the leading edge of like research to know that this thing was happening in the background. It was very early. You had no companies in Europe looking at this. Drone startups were very small. So like I had to start something myself. And because of this, I just went on to small drones, because it felt like the right amount of, of ambition. Because like starting a company that is going to build electric air taxi when you're like a first time entrepreneur sounds a bit too crazy. So that's why I kind of went, okay, where do you need the most the technology, and also where does it feel like the right amount of challenge? And again, like building drones and hardware is actually quite difficult already as a first time startup.
Well, let's attack this from a couple of angles, and let's get to marine surveillance soon. But why don't we just go through some specifics about the drone industry and the devices that you're operating on? So there seems to be a kind of a crude classification of drones into kind of consumer drones, commercial drones, and then obviously the military market, and then there's more experimental drones. I guess some people call them R&D drones, and then some people, I guess, would put government drones into kind of a special in between category. But I don't know if that makes so much sense. How do you categorize the various broad types of drones or drone markets, I guess?
I think it's a very difficult thing to answer when you're at the very beginning of the industry, because if you look if we were to look if we were 20 years into the future and we were looking at today would definitely feel like very, very early stage compared to what's coming. And because of that, it's hard to see what are going to be the actual categories into the future. Right now, there's tons of people experimenting in widely different areas, and most of them are going to disappear eventually. So it's hard to like properly find categories because there are so many of them. I guess the easiest way would be, definitely you have the kind of consumer movie making type of drones, which are like dominated by one Chinese company. And this is mostly a sorted problem. And then you have the military type stuff, which also like has been going for a while. So that's also quite defined. But everything that's two extremes of performance and price. But in between, it's very open. And there is a range of prices. So I guess the main difference at that point is like, is it a fixed wing? Is it like a plane? Is it more like a small helicopter, like the quadcopters? Is it a mix between the two? It's actually quite difficult to find categories at the minute. It's just too early and too like open across use cases and technologies.
So I want to talk about a bunch of different aspects, but let's go to the types of parameters that matter in terms of drones. And I'm going to line up a couple, and I want you to sort of structure this for me. So you and I in the pre-call talked about cost. So this is obviously very, very important because, at a certain cost level, you can buy one drone, if you're a company, or at another cost level, you can buy 50. So cost is clearly, especially early, right after you experiment, when you want to try to just, introduce drones into sort of your portfolio of doing something with it. Cost is clearly important. But then some of the technical characteristics, I'm just going to list off a few. What are the most important to you? So there, speed, obviously, is how fast can this thing go? Weight, right? So is it lightweight? And I guess that ties into materials. What sort of temperatures can it deal with? What sort of flight time can this drone endure? And I guess brings us to kind of the drivetrain and also the power of what powers the drone. All of these things seem a little technical, but they clearly have, they have sustainability implications. They have implications for how many of these things you can run together. And then there's various amounts of special payloads. I'm imagining that some of your clients, right, they want some sensor on it. They, in addition to just sort of a basic camera, they want specialized, wide angle camera, so you can kind of watch more stuff, and then all sorts of sensors depending on what you're trying to do there. And then it seems to me that altitude also is a very big feature. Some drones can fly at very high altitude that may not be needed for other use cases. What are the main parameters, as you are looking into the marine use case?
Well, it's a super, super wide question, and I think it's very interesting. So I would say most of those parameters do not matter ultimately to the customer. And I guess the equivalent would be, if you're trying to buy like a satellite imagery, ultimately, if you buy the data from like, a very high orbit like satellite or something further down, ultimately, like the combination of that altitude or the optics you have might get you the same result. And most customers, I don't think, would look at those technical details. They'll just say, what is the resolution I'm getting? And what is the sensor? Is it optical? Is it like infrared? Is it like multispectral, whatever? And then the cost you're paying for that. So I think these are like the one that actually matter. And all the others are more like different ways to approach the problem and solve for those kind of like three parameters.
I guess I'm approaching it from a geek angle, which, in sort of early markets, there's a lot of geeks purchasing these things. So I guess I'm catering to that early adopter type.
I think right now what's interesting in the drone space that I think maybe people are not looking at enough is like figuring out what those metrics are, because it's kind of like one of the way we're thinking about solving this problem. We're thinking, imagine again, you're 20 years from now, and at that point there will be a kind of like a technical engineering book that you go to university, study how you design electric drones, and there will be a technical book which will tell you which are the 10 main parameters and how you optimize them, and there will be equations that describe these. And there's probably tons and tons of things that won't be covered because it will be implicit that they don't really matter. But today we don't know what these things are. So it's like, how do you figure out what these are? And kind of nobody knows. And some people don't even look at that. They're just trying to solve, some customer is asking one problem and you just try to solve that problem rather than figure out long-term what's going to be the most important things.
So I guess to just be specific, why I'm asking this question is I'm interested in the same thing as you. I'm interested in the next 20 years, right? So our concern on this podcast isn't simply, what are the fancy players operating today, but it's trying to figure out what's going to decide whether we'll have 1 million drones flying around in every country, or we're going to have 10 million. Right now, there's something like, I think the FAA has almost 1 million drones registered, right? So there's I think 800,000 something. I can look that up in a second. drones registered in the US. But it is interesting whether this is, in 20 years from now going to be 50 million, and what materials might those things be made of, and what sort of demands are we going to put on those? What are they going to be doing? It's pretty open, like you said. It's very open right now.
So what's interesting was when you were talking about like number of units, I think the actual thing that matters is more like how many hours of flight cumulatively you'll have across the industry. Because for example, you have a lot less airliners in the world that you have like number of small drones, but these airliners fly 24/7. The drones, like the 1 million you've talked about, a lot of them are going to be recreational that people use like maybe 20 minutes a month kind of thing. Then the impact's actually quite limited. I think long term, what really matters is how many dollars per utility does whether that is a square kilometer of data or a kilometer moved over, a kilogram moved over a kilometer. If you're turning to logistics, that's the metric.
So just to help me understand that, right now, what do you think manufacturers of industrial drones are they? Because you were saying 40 years for an airplane. Are people in such an experimental market? I mean, are you assuming that these drones will last a year? They will last 3 years? Like, what is a reasonable expectation right now in this very experimental market for what am I buying? What is this asset going to do for me?
So the range is, so for quadcopters, like the toy ones that most people buy nowadays, the figure by the FAA a few years ago when they were looking at this, I think was 50 hours. That's how long it would take statistically for like an average of one of these drones to crash. And most of the time, these are not pilot error. This is actually like failure from the system. So that's for like one end of the spectrum. And then if you look at larger drones, so for example, the Scan Eagle, which is like one of the ones from Boeing's, which is one of the most widely used military drones. It's like, I think it's like 15, 20 kilos, 3 meter span. That drone, the average time between crashes is probably between 500 to 700 hours. So you're still talking very, 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 very short lifespans. And that's one of the big reasons why it's still very expensive. Right. So it is very far from where it needs to be compared to like the airliner, for sure.
Why don't we start talking a little bit about some of the use cases? So the main use case that we'll dive into is marine surveillance. So let's leave that aside for the first question. So what are, in your opinion, the most interesting use cases that people are already starting to deploy drones for? So I can list off a couple of them, but the traditional one that people had in mind early on was package delivery. Because sci-fi would have told us that you can sit there and basically get your package delivered. Now, I don't know that matters so much to people anymore, because we've found very simple ways of basically hiring drivers all around to give us these packages. So I don't know if that would change my life if the package came by a drone as opposed to hand delivered with a camera proof. So I don't know exactly if, unless you live on an island far away, that may not be the killer application of drones, I'm just saying. But there are a plethora of other sort of surveillance type tasks and communication and sensing tasks. What do you find the most compelling use cases are?
Well, so first, yeah, I would agree with you. Like logistics, not the most interesting thing. And I think as well, when you, as like an entrepreneur, you think both about like what's exciting in terms of use case, but we also think about what makes sense at what stage of the industry. And like package delivery is very difficult in terms of regulatory aspects, so it might not be the best to do very early on, even though longer term it might be interesting. But yeah, so thinking about what's interesting in the marine space is just like, all the robotics and drones are a portion of robotics. It's always interesting to look at like what's dull, dirty, and dangerous to do. And the sea is like, it's everywhere in the sea is mostly going to be remote, right? So you can't easily get access to like 50 kilometers offshore. So it's really difficult to do anything there and collect data. So the sea is in general interesting for drones because of that. And then within this, the most exciting topics we look at, I think, is going to be things like, so a very specific one is sargassum. So I don't know if you've heard of sargassum. It's a seaweed in the Atlantic because of like global warming and like pesticide into the water. It's just been growing much more recently to the point where it grows in the Atlantic. And then now last year you had 72 million tons of it that made its way into the Caribbean, which normally it just stays in the Atlantic. And that ends up on the beach. When it deteriorates, it releases methane. It releases some other toxic components. It destroys the ecosystem, and also it's terrible for tourism. And so what you want to do is go pick it up before it reaches the shore. The thing to do that, you're going to go with very big boats to collect thousands of tons of it. And to do that, you want to know exactly where that seaweed is before you go send those expensive vessels to just troll around. And you can't really do that with any other means than by drones, because satellites give you typically outdated data by a few days. So you need to go with drones. And you can't use military drones because the budget for those use cases are not the one from like defense. So that's a very interesting one, for example. Another one is in general trying to quantify the environment. What I mean by that is it's becoming quite popular nowadays in government, and that's kind of an exciting thing, is that they're starting to look at ecosystems as a natural capital. So that, let's say, for example, the UK in their waters have 211 billion pound worth of natural capital. So that's like, the sea will provide a service as an environment by producing fish, and that fish, almost like if it was a company, like the sea, it generates fish, and that provides value to the UK society. Wind is the same. Or CO2 that is stored in the water. And if you consider this as an asset, like a monetary asset, then you want to monitor it. And right now, there's no good way to monitor it. So using drones to do that and provide the tools to government to make better decisions on how you manage that asset is also a very exciting thing for us.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And then I guess there is also, because it is an asset, in Brazil, for example, illegal activity around your asset is a problem. So illegal fishing, illegal logging, illegal behavior that destroys or extracts value from that asset that you're not able to monitor. So that would seem to me a pretty legitimate and also very, very important governmental use case.
Mm-hmm. And I think, completely true. And I think it's even more, that effect is compounded because the countries that are most victim of illegal fishing are countries that do not have the means to control their waters. So that's going to be, African country, South American country, where you get foreign vessels coming into the water and just trawling, destroying the ecosystem, and basically stealing the economic resource of the country. Western countries have enough money and like resources to protect that, but all these other countries don't have it. So it's similarly, like that's why using drones, which provide a low-cost way to monitor that ecosystem and protect it against foreign fishing vessel is fishing illegally feels like a very important problem to address.
How old is the commercial use of drones? I mean, I imagine it can't be very, very old as an industry, because we read about all these experiments, but how many true clients are there right now that are ready to not just spend dollars on a drone here and there, but who are actually going out Monday morning and catching people, or observing their mammalian population of African animals?
I mean, so finding an exact, it's difficult obviously to find an exact date, because there must have been money made commercially with drones like a long time ago. Like for example, the Scan Eagle I mentioned, that Boeing drone that lasts 500 to 700 hours, is mostly used for military. This was originally developed for fisheries protection, actually. So it was like a commercial use case originally, and that's a drone from the early 2000s. And actually, that company that developed that drone, they flew a drone across the Atlantic, like a 3-kilo drone in 1998. So there's been lots of things around drone for a long time. But if you look at today, actually, the percentage of the economic value that people predict drone will have in the long term, only 2% of that has been realized today. And most of that is, survey your house with like a small quadcopter. So we're still very, very early in the realization of the full economic potential.
No, I see that. I think there's a company called Drone Insights that has a figure that the current drone market is something like $26 billion in the US, and they're forecasting obviously to 2030, a doubling of the market to like 54 billion. Does that seem reasonable to you? And is the drone market in the US a special case, or would you say that this is a pretty global market in the sense that I guess the barrier to entry in this market is very, very low?
So that number you're talking about, I don't have like the reference or like the details.
No, and I mean, I think it's one of the companies that provides intelligence on this, but I would agree with you that the numbers are sort of taken out of the air a little bit. But
yeah. So that today by far still, well, I mean, there's only two big areas where there's a lot of money in the drone space, but actually it's just mostly military still at the minute. Like by far, the most volume of revenue is in the military, or otherwise it's the small quadcopter, like more like recreational movie making type things. In between, there isn't that much. I don't. Is it going to be biased towards the US? I mean, probably like just volume of the size of the economy. There's going to be more application, but I don't think it's going to be biased more than just as a ratio to how big the economy of the country is. Mm-hmm. And those numbers sound pretty big. 26 billion today, that must account for defense. Like it's not commercial.
Right. That's the defense number. Well, I guess the interesting thing is sort of the barriers to entry, and maybe we can go into a little bit of your experience there with the startup. How difficult is it to enter this business today? So maybe tell a little bit about when you started with your company and where that's kind of going.
So I think there's going to be still plenty of companies to come up that haven't started yet. So yeah, and I don't think the barrier to entry are going to, like, it's just getting easier and easier to start a hardware company because of 3D printing. Access to capital is getting a bit easier for funding hardware companies, because venture capital used to hate hardware, and now they're kind of changing that a little bit. Potentially all the defense applications with like the conflicts across the world right now, there's also more capital going into that, so it might be a little bit easier. So the barrier to entry might be lower, but let's say having started the company in 2016, we've realized how many things we had to figure out and how long it took us to like get to something that is actually useful. So it might be like there's still space for plenty of people to start companies, but it's still very, very difficult because the cost of iteration, you still need plenty of iteration to figure out what works, and the cost of an iteration and the time of an iteration in hardware is just so much longer than software. I think if I was starting a company today, I'd probably think looking at those established manufacturers or people providing drone services today, what are the things that they're developing in-house that they wish they were not developing in-house? So for us, for example, we build a full drone, but there are things that we need to do by ourselves because we don't have third parties that do that. So there might be some integration of two sensors, and then we need to do some bespoke hardware and pieces of software that does the glue between those two sensors. Or there might be, like, there's plenty of small elements that we need to build ourselves. And so there are going to be tons of companies, I think, that get started in those areas.
So tell me a little bit about then Marble and what you chose to focus on in with your company. So you sort of say for now that marine monitoring is your main use case. Why is that, and how's that going?
So the reason we picked marine monitoring is I think twofold. One is, I said, like, when you're early in an industry, you want to figure out what's the right thing to do at each, when the industry is not yet fully developed and you have like specific constraint because of that. So one of the big ones with drones at the minute is the regulations. So you're not allowed to fly a drone by itself. You need to have a pilot that can see the drone at all time. And that pilot typically needs to be 500 meters away from the drone. So that's very constraining. And obviously you can't really fly above water if you just limit it to 500 meters away from where the pilot is. So that is like still the rule today. It's going to change in the future for sure. And so today, if you want to fly further than 500 meters, you need exemptions. These exemptions are much easier to get above water because it's easier to argue with the regulators that, if I go fly above the water, there won't be anyone, so I'm not going to crash into a plane. If something happens, there's nobody on the ground. It's much easier to do that than above land. So there's a regulatory aspect and a need, like how easy it is to deploy the solution that is a bit better above sea than it is above land. The second thing is that maritime monitoring has actually been done by drones for a very long time, just in the defense space. So there's already a reference as to what it looks like, what's the business model, like rather than if you were to do logistics, for example, you need to reinvent everything yourself. And maybe the last aspect is, I said earlier, if I was to start a company today, I would look at the layer of the stack and figure out what are the elements that companies are doing themselves that they wish they could subcontract to someone else. So what you want to do today is find the use case that has probably the least amount of layers in the stack, because then it's easier to solve it rather than something very complex that has tons of people that interact with, right? And marine monitoring, because you're literally just flying the drone and having sensors on it and detecting boats, and then that's the end of the outcome. Like, it's not the most complex thing. You can imagine, for example, monitoring agriculture. It's a lot more complex because you need to fly specific sensors. You need to post-process the data a lot more. Then you need to give an insight to a farmer on what type of pesticide they might apply, and then you need to wait a year until to see the result. So that's why like those three elements of regulation, minimal layer of stack in the stack to solve a complete problem, and then the fact that it's not a completely new industry. That's why we kind of picked it, this specific domain.
Yeah, no, that sounds interesting. But let me quibble on that a little bit, though. I mean, marine monitoring, it all just depends on your ambition level, right? Because you were referring to the UN Ocean Treaty earlier, which was signed last year after, a 20-year negotiation process here. And if we're going to look at some of the spirit of that agreement, it actually means protect the ocean. And as we all know, there's a lot of stuff going wrong with the ocean. So if you're truly going to put sensors in the ocean, maybe even under the ocean, right? So here we're talking about a very complex assemblage of technologies above and below water. So it's not necessarily as simple as just spotting a fishing boat here and there.
No, completely. I agree. But that's kind of like you have a nice entry point, and then you can scale from that and get like that much larger solution. It is a massive problem. Like you referred to protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030. That's something like globally all countries have signed up for. They're going to do that. And the issue is you talk to anyone involved in that process in government, and they all tell you that whatever document they sign now that say, oh, this area is protected, it's actually just like it's just a paper statement. There's no enforcement whatsoever. Even if you're the wealthiest country on the planet, you actually can't enforce these things, let alone like, if you're a smaller country. So it's a massive problem. And there are not many people looking at how you solve that. And it's critical. So that's more like the aspirational reason as to why we're doing this. Like the one I gave you earlier is more like the, tactically as a startup, you need to think through like, what makes sense economically and everything. But there's definitely a massive problem that needs to be solved.
Why don't we talk a little bit about the challenges? Because you've made all these choices. You have a company now that's sort of trying to scale up within a use case that you think makes sense. There's so much optimism out there about drones. They're exciting use case, but there's also, like we have started talking about, a lot of challenges within the various. You called it within the layers. I mean, one super basic one is just some of these drones rely on batteries, and batteries has been this like enormous challenge that we've been working on and then not really made a tremendous amount of progress on. And then if you don't use batteries, well, you're using some sort of gas or some sort of liquid fuel, and then that also has to be refueled. What is the biggest sort of technical challenge, or are there just challenges all along the various layers, from like drivetrain to the shape of these drones? What is the optimal shape? And then I want to eventually talk a little bit about optimization, because, one drone is one thing, but presumably in this scenario you're talking about, monitoring the ocean, people want swarms of drones to do that, right? If you were the ex-government, in some large state that has ocean resources, or if you are the UN who want to monitor international waters, you're not going to be happy with one drone, right? You're not going to be happy with 100,000 drones. You're talking about swarms of drones coming from various places that are not crashing into each other. This is a major AI problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thinking about like what are the big technical problems? I think there's no fundamental physics problem. So it's not like we're trying to like do some big breakthrough. And like, for example, if you were to think about the equivalent being like SpaceX early on, like they knew their big breakthrough was to be able to land a rocket vertically. And then since they've proven that, like everything they've done, even doing it at like, on Starship, like a much bigger vessel, you're still, I mean, it's a very, very, very difficult execution, but you're still not breaking anything you haven't de-risked before. And what they're doing now, they still have plenty of crashes. That's because you don't know what is the thing that is going to break in your execution, and it's very, very hard to know in advance. And I think the drone space is mostly at that stage. We don't need a big breakthrough in anything. We just need to start building the drones and like scale them and do way more operation. And then as that happens, you just get more mature. And if you look at the plane industry, that's what has happened. If you look at one of the main plot that describes the history of aviation, it's a time on that axis, and then it's on like you plot against. I'm realizing I'm doing with my hand, but I'm not sure. People might just have the audio. So imagine you plot against time, and you have the curve is how long does it take on average for a plane to crash, and that curve is obviously going up over time as you get better. And this has happened the exact same curve for airliners, for jet fighters, for general aviation, like the small plane helicopters. And all of these go up because people go through iterations. So, for example, in the 70s with the first jet planes, you had problem with pressurization, and you had plane exploding in midair because we didn't know what was important to how to pressurize a plane. And then this hasn't happened since because we fixed it. And so, getting back to your point, I don't think we don't need a specific breakthrough, and I can't tell you in advance which are going to be those problems, because we just need to actually go through that curve of experience and just fix them. And maybe what would be interesting specifically, you were saying batteries. We use batteries. We don't use like internal combustion, probably for two reasons. One is like internal combustion doesn't feel like the future. So it's like, why would we build that? The second thing is long-term, you want to have those drones operating from a robotic infrastructure where, they land, they have the battery recharged or swapped. And I'm struggling to imagining having like a robotic nozzle that just comes into the drone and just refuels it. Like, again, doesn't feel like the future. So we're fixed to, we're going to do batteries. And then within this, actually, they're getting quite a bit better. So we haven't been sourcing any exotic batteries. We used to use like the off-the-shelf radio-controlled aircraft type of batteries. And these one, even if you were just buying them from the same radio-controlled aircraft shop, they were just getting better over time. They weren't even branding it or anything. They were just getting better slowly. And now we just use lithium ion, which is what you have in a Tesla. And same, it's actually consistently getting better. You might not notice it between one year and the next, but when we look back 5 years from now, it's like 30% better, 40% better. And now we're starting to look at more exotic, like not more exotic, but like what isn't on the market yet, and talking to people that are developing things. And there is a lot of exciting stuff in the pipeline. So I think batteries.
Yeah, no, I wasn't meaning to dismiss battery science. I think I agree with you. A tremendous amount of change has happened, but I'm just pointing out that it took us a long time to get there. And there are no enormous breakthroughs to sort of put in Science magazine. But yes, over time, there has been true improvement. So that does help.
Yeah.
What about the security use case? I don't know if that is going to matter so much to marine monitoring, but well, certainly on the military side, it matters. Aren't most of the communication channels open? So you're using wireless communication, right?
So you mean security, like how secure the wireless communication?
How secure is the information you are getting?
So it is. So answering that question is interesting because there isn't like the way drones communicate today between the drone and basically the ground. There are several different ways you can do that, and in the future, I'm sure there's only going to be one or two. And so, talking about security for those different channels, like I'm basically going to tell you how it works today, but that might not even be relevant in the future.
Are you saying that because regulation will come in and just simplify things?
No, I mean, I'm saying this because Starlink is coming, and that's going to make everything simpler.
Right.
And generally, that's going to be a massive breakthrough for drones, because the way you communicate now mostly is you do direct line of sight between the drone and the ground operator. That is an extremely it's actually quite difficult to do because you have big regulations on what frequencies you're allowed to use, what power levels you're allowed to use, and that massively limit the range of how far you can fly, limits the bandwidth. And also, it doesn't work well if you have multiple drones because they're all speaking on the same frequencies. So that's why some people, when I say there are multiple ways to do this nowadays, is like if you go to a different country, you might have to use a different frequency. You might have two systems in parallel on your drone, one for just the telemetry and one for the video. So you can do that, or you can also use a 4G chip. So you just use GSM, but that might not work at sea because you don't have like a telecommunication tower out at sea. So that's why like Starlink ultimately, especially with the new thing of doing direct to cell, you don't need to worry about communication anymore. And I guess I haven't answered your question about security, but for example, on the Starlink front, I guess it's almost like I don't actually know exactly the level of security, but I assume that's kind of like they solved that issue. Same with 4G. So if we talk specifically security, the one I thought you probably were, the one I think you were mentioning is the one when you do direct communication. So a traditional quadcopter, for example, you have your controller on the ground and you're talking to the drone. These are encrypted. I think it'd be very difficult to hack them today. But long term, I think these systems won't really work. You won't use them anyway. I think you'd just buy a drone, or you would be paying the service for a drone that just have Starlink on it, and it doesn't talk to you. It talks to the internet directly.
Got it. What's your view on where we are with machine learning and AI in drones today? You know, what you were saying that it's early days generally. there have been rumors out of various war zones that some limited amount of machine intelligence has been used for some of these long distance drones with these kind of spectacular attacks thousands of miles away. How far are we in the commercial testing of more advanced AI algorithms for targeting, but also for communication?
So the application nowadays in defense where you have machine learning are going to they're quite narrow. So a big issue when you're flying a drone in a contested airspace, like when there's like a conflict, is that people are trying to jam you. So that's like your communication, and they're also trying to jam your GPS. So and these two things are relatively easy to do. So that means you need to be able to have a drone that can fly itself completely and make decision potentially because it doesn't have a means of communicating to its owner/operator. And also that drone needs to be able to navigate without GPS. So for solving the GPS portion, what people are doing nowadays is basically doing inertial navigation, which you can do on large airplanes, for example, by having very expensive, large inertial systems. But on small, cheap drones that are used on the front, they use very cheap inertial sensors, and these are not good enough. They would have so much drift that if you were using inertial navigation, the drone wouldn't get, it'd be very imprecise. And so the machine learning there is basically if you couple those cheap in navigation sensor and a machine learning model of the plane that knows exactly what to expect of the behavior, these two can work together and you basically get a much more accurate inertial navigation system. And at that point, you have a drone that can fly without GPS. That's probably like that's a very narrow use case of machine learning, but it's probably one of the most powerful one on the front at the minute. The second one is like, if you don't have communication, is how can you make the drone take decision? And so you can use computer vision. For this, I actually don't know what's happening because it's probably quite secretive. But what I would assume is you have plenty of open source models to do computer vision that can pretty accurately detect a vehicle. And if you could probably fairly easily program a drone that just, if you don't have any ethical problem with that, just say, as soon as you find a vehicle past that distance away from us, just go crash on it. It probably isn't a difficult thing to do. And again, I don't know if that's why I assume they might be doing, but that's where I would see machine learning. I don't think there's anything fancy, and it's just like repurposing open source stuff, probably.
What about on the engineering side? I'm just, and I haven't really researched this to death, but if you just think about the Wright brothers and back in the day, right, in the early parts of the century, it was obviously very costly to experiment with the basic physics of the air, and these hardware demos were expensive. Plus, you die if you crash your plane the wrong way. This is obviously very different with drones. It's almost like you have a lab in the air, and the risks, like you pointed out, are so much lower. Is that going to, or has it already led to any major reevaluations of aerodynamics or even of material composition? And are we going to see any, or is there any massive experimentation there that potentially could benefit larger aircraft?
Interesting. So it's a very interesting point because I got into drones thinking it's just a much better space to experiment because, as you said, the cost of iteration, in capital, and then risk to life also much lower. So you can do many more iterations, so you're going to get better at learning. It turns out like the thing when you're something in a very immature industry, it doesn't really matter how good you are in one of the specific disciplines. What matters is figuring out what is the concept that works. And if you start spending too much time or effort into any narrow thing, you actually probably don't get anywhere. So I would say right now, this hasn't happened yet because what matters is, again, like just top level picture, what is the best solution rather than any specific development. However, there is definitely one area where I think it's already clear that the drones are a great area to use that technology, and you can't really use it in the bigger planes yet. And that's additive manufacturing or 3D printing. So our drones are fully 3D printed, like the one behind me. And that is using, these ones are using SLA. So that's like using a laser to cure a resin. It's not the most durable thing, but it's quite strong and inexpensive. But we're actually looking at SLS 3D printing into metal. And the reason why drones work so well for this is 3D printers have still pretty small build volume. If you're not talking like very inaccurate type of system that can print much larger, like the accurate one, I still have pretty small build volume. And so that means if you can't really print a big aircraft in 3D printing, you would need to print lots of small parts in 3D printing and still assemble them, which defeats a big part of 3D printing, which is it gives you the finished part straight away. for drones of this size, you can actually get printed a fairly large portion of the aircraft. So this plane takes us, I think it's like 4 or 5 days of printing. It's like maybe 8 parts. So it's a great use case for 3D printing, and it makes a big difference to how quickly, how cheaply, and how light can you build a plane. For the rest of like aerodynamics, there hasn't been any breakthrough or anything, I don't think yet.
Interesting. Well, I guess I have only one question about the future. Where do you think this phenomenon of the drone is going to go in the next decade, and maybe let's talk beyond? Is it going to be this experimental thing with lots of different use cases, but no massive sort of centralized investment from a government party or a one big industry player like we see now? It's sort of spread out a little bit. It's dispersed innovation, I would say. Or is this going to be grasped by some entrepreneur, government, constellation of industries, maybe even the existing airline industry, and then just massively take off because of some giga investment in some sort of breakthrough? What is your best prediction on that?
I'm not sure exactly how it will happen, but I think it's inevitable. When you look at the fundamental cost benefits, like we're very far today from what can be achieved with drones. And when the really basic, when you look at how cheap it can be and how good it can be at collecting data or moving things around, from the fundamental physics, it's obvious that long term it's going to be something that happens everywhere. And I think that vision, what it's going to be, it's a bit like, I think maybe in the pre-call I mentioned this, but it's like, if you look at satellites where they used to be 30, 40 years ago, if you wanted data from a satellite, you had to go talk to a satellite designer and manufacturer. They would put one in space. They would design one for you. You would buy it. You would put it in space, and then you would be free to use your satellite. But you would have paid that whole thing just for yourself. Obviously, today, if you want satellite imagery, you don't do any of that. You just go talk to someone who owns like a constellation, and you just pay for like a tiny, tiny portion of the usage of the whole constellation, and you get the data. Drones today are still very much like satellite 30 or 40 years ago. If you want drone data, you just have to go speak to someone, and they fly the drone for you, but they will go somewhere and fly the drone just for your use case, so you have to pay for like everything for that one operation. Long term, I think it's inevitable that you're just going to have like hundreds of millions of drones flying everywhere that you could tap into by accessing a web portal similarly to what you have for satellite imagery today. And you would just say, okay, I want data tomorrow, every 5 minutes in this area. How much does that cost me? You get a real-time estimate, and then the drones collect the data, and you get that. And I think it's inevitable. It's hard to know exactly how it will happen. But yeah, and I think when it will happen,
how fast it will happen, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's an interesting future. I think it seems to me that you're right. Drones will be part of our future, but exactly how is at the moment anybody's guess, even if you're an entrepreneur in this space. Well, Matt, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Trond.
You have just listened to another episode of the Futurized podcast with me, Trond Arne Undheim, futurist, scholar, and author. If you are interested in my products or services, feel free to check out futurized.org/store, where you can book a keynote speech, become a sponsor or partner, request a podcast swap, or buy a few of my books, such as Augmented Lean, Health Tech, Future Tech, Pandemic Aftermath, Disruption Games, or Leadership from Below. If you're interested in any or all of my projects, check out my website, trondundheim.com, which has links to other podcasts as well as my public appearances. Thank you. Please share this show with those you care about. To find us on social media is easy. We are Futurized on LinkedIn and YouTube, and Futurized 2 on Instagram and Twitter. See you next time. Futurized, conversations that matter.